I hate this subject so fucking much.
Yeah.
I can't agree with you or Popper, even when Popper seemingly agrees with me. God damn it. She keep a list of jobs she's been offered as some sort of badge of honor.
yeah. Because she doesn't even need a job. She just wants to keep practicing these interviews. And then she was telling me this other story where she took a computer science course in her undergrad and then just like paid an autistic dude $25 to do all of her assignments. But then I guess this was during COVID, where the final exam is like on video, right? So she literally paid the dude to like sit underneath the camera.
No way.
She was 100%. So she was on camera for like an hour and a half, just going like, this kind of thing. And he was just like crouched, sitting in this like little stool, and then just like typing and doing all these little leet code problems like under the camera.
Oh my God.
Just like
she's trying to make sure she's not touching.
Yeah.
She's trying to make sure she's not touching her face with both hands while he's actually typing.
Yeah, exactly. I guess she got like she got an A+, and I was like, so what what did you have to learn in that class? And she's like, no idea at all. So here's one I wanted to bring up too, relating to our is all thought problem solving.
Oh, good
debate.
Lord!
No, you're gonna like this. You're gonna like this. I found a quote from Popper saying the exact opposite of what I was saying he said. So
I do like this.
Yeah. So to the extent that I was speaking for Popper, I was just wrong. You were right. I was wrong. But what he said is actually pretty interesting, and I figured it might be worth batting around for just a couple minutes because you can get a giant "I told you so," and I just think it's interesting. So this comes from the first chapter in his book "In Search of a Better World," which I read a while ago, but I was just kind of re-skimming through it, and then this paragraph stood out to me. So he's talking about consciousness. My basic assumption regarding World 2 is that this problem-solving activity of the animate part of World 1 resulted in the emergence of World 2, of the world of consciousness. And then here's what he says. But I do not mean by this that consciousness solves problems all the time, as I asserted about organisms. On the contrary, the organisms are preoccupied with problem-solving day in, day out, but consciousness is not only concerned with the solving of problems, although that is most of its important biological function. My hypothesis is that the original task of consciousness was to anticipate success and failure in problem solving and to signal to the organism in the form of pleasure and pain whether it's on the right or wrong path to the solution of a problem. So this, I thought, was like way more nuanced and interesting than what I was saying he was saying. So I just got to correct the record and take back that I was saying Popper thought this, because he clearly says something more nuanced. And so what do you think about this? That consciousness evolved primarily to anticipate successes and failures in the problem-solving apparatus, and then signal to the organism in terms of pleasure and pain, whether it's on the right or wrong path. What are your thoughts on that? And also, feel free to gloat as much as you like about how wrong I was too.
No, I'm right more often than not on this podcast. I don't even need to gloat. I'm very familiar with this feeling of victory. So.
True.
Well, so does this change your mind as someone who can't stand to disagree with Popper? I'm curious if this now forces you to confront what you had said in previous episodes.
Yeah, so I want to go back and re-listen to what I said. I think your criticisms forced me to have a much more refined view of like my own thought process. And through that discussion, it came about that I do just consciously think about problem solving much more. And then I was also watering down the definition of problem solving to encapsulate a much wider set of things. And so maybe where I have to recant what I was saying is that Popper did not water down his definition of problem solving when he attacked this problem. So I need to just maybe not give myself that out, because I was lying. I was relying on my misreading of Popper to grant me the permission to expand the definition of problem solving. But Popper rejects that. And to the extent I was just relying on his authority, then I need to just kind of be humble and say that I was going farther than he went to defend his theory. And so I would back off on that claim now, because this is a much more interesting way to think about it, I think.
All it takes is 2 sentences from Popper to change your mind. And 4 hours of arguing over audio of me saying basically the identical thing. It did zero. I don't know. I don't know what to call this besides hero worship, to be honest. That's what's going on.
Fair. Partially is that I was defending what I was reading Popper to say, but I was just wrong in my reading of him. So I need to, I don't want to defend something that he himself wouldn't defend.
But who cares? We were asking for your view on whether all thoughts are problem solving. I think anyone listening to that disagreement would think this is Vaden's view, not what Vaden thinks Popper's view is, right?
No, 100%. Yeah, I was relying pretty heavily on Popperian epistemology to ground out what I was saying, for sure. Yeah.
But then if that's true, then it shouldn't change your mind to just read 2 sentences from Popper on the subject.
Well, what changed my mind is that this is just a better theory. It's just more interesting, and there's just more stuff there, I think. And so to the extent that I because you were just saying, no, all thought isn't problem solving. And this is just more interesting. So I just want to
I made the exact same points. I was like, your subconscious is not doing this all the time. He's saying consciously you're trying to solve problems sometimes. And that's great. And he's saying, but there's more to consciousness than just what you're consciously doing all the time. There's, i.e., a subconscious. And that's what I kept saying. There's lots of dwelling you're doing day to day that's not explicit problem solving. I don't know. That's exactly what he said.
No, but he said it's not he's saying what consciousness's role was. You didn't offer me that. You didn't say consciousness is not about problem solving, but it is instead about indicating solutions to problems via pleasure and pain. That's interesting and makes sense with the rest of Popperian epistemology. But if consciousness just was doing just random other stuff, it was just like a spandrel. It had to jive with the problems are at the foundation of everything. And this jives better. And so
I hate this subject so fucking much.
Yeah.
I can't agree with you or Popper, even when Popper seemingly agrees with me. God damn it.
Okay, well let's get into the main subject. Welcome back to another episode of Increments. My name is Vaden Masrani, Senior Research Scientist in Machine Learning, and Mr. Benny Fire Cannon Chug.
Fire Cannon?
Fire Cannon. Because you're shooting fucking flames? You're all fire and brimstone? I don't know. I thought Fire Cannon was funny.
Because my co-host won't change his mind when I present him with the same points that Popper makes.
I brought this up because I didn't... I brought it up in order to say mea culpa, mea culpa. I was wrong. Anyways, we'll let the audience decide. From Carnegie Mellon University.
If you want to get in touch with us, best way to do so is either pay us money on Patreon, and then we will definitely pay attention to you, or come join our Discord. The link, the link is not in the comments, but you can email us for a link, and then we'll give you the link. We haven't said this much, but to be honest, I think the Discord is sort of one of the things I'm most proud of that has actually emerged from this podcast. We've gotten to talk to some very cool people, which has been amazing. But to be honest, the small community that's formed around the Discord is incredibly gratifying. And it's just very cool that it's sort of taken on a life of its own. Vaden is a little more active there than I am, but it's sort of a delight for me to wake up each morning and then see that the Discord has been active with people engaging and arguing about all sorts of subjects all night long. So if you want to come hang out with us, that's definitely the best place to do it. And that's where you can shout at Vaden for being incredibly annoying and compliment me for being so nice and restrained. Except for the last YouTube commenter who told me I'm a terrible debater, which has scarred me for life, to be honest. Now I'm frightened of ever disagreeing with anyone in public again. So
one of the Discord comments, I won't say their name, gave me 10 paragraphs of why I'm an EA hater. Guilty as charged, I guess. So I'm going to be responding to that. So if you want a lot more unfiltered Vaden hate, come join the Discord.
It was the sweetest way to call you out I've ever seen. He was worried about being too harsh, and then was absolutely not harsh enough, I would say. I think he could have taken many more swings. I was waiting for the real cannons to come out.
Good to be humbled daily. Shall we kick it off? So part 2 of the Conjectures and Refutations series.
Yeah, cool. So perhaps just to summarize sort of where we ended. So Popper has this notion of the content of a theory. So the logical content of a theory is the set of all statements that are logically entailed by that statement, just meaning all of the logical consequences that follow from that statement. And then a subset of the logical content is the empirical content. And so these are the set of all empirical statements entailed by a given theory. Or in other words, just all the set of its potential falsifiers. So all the things that could falsify the theory. And Popper was a fan of falsification, as we know. And so his claim is that we want to look at theories with high content. In other words, theories that are risky, that posit a lot about the world and therefore could be falsified by many, many statements. Popper then, both here and in Logic of Scientific Discovery earlier, relates content to probability, noting simply that the content of two conjoined statements can only increase, while the probability, if you're going to put probability over statements, as some people like to do, then the probability of two conjoined statements can only decrease from each of those individual statements. Vaden and I then proceeded to get into a approximately 90-minute long debate that was shortened to maybe 30 minutes for the audience about how deep this insight goes and to what extent it is a problem for all those using probability in science. I'm hesitant to say too much here, lest we sort of open up the can of worms. But I think perhaps it's important to just say that insofar as your epistemology is concerned with providing theories that have higher and higher probability, because of this inverse relationship with content, that means you're actually looking for theories that have lower and lower content. And Popper's says that's not what we want. And we would both agree with that. Then there's a disagreement about what more this says, I think, about probability. Does this impact the daily probabilists' use of probability when they're doing statistics, for instance? Does this totally annihilate the Bayesian interpretation of probability, which again, I'm no fan of, but I actually disagree that this is that much of a rocket sort of launched at that entire program. Whereas Vaden thinks, I think that it's sort of much more consequential in its Popper's observation here is much more consequential in its consequences for just how everyone thinks and uses probability. But I think we can both say that maybe the place that we can agree is just to say that, again, insofar as your epistemology is just predicated on looking for things with higher and higher probability, then you're going to run into trouble if you also try and look for things that have high empirical content, i.e. are readily falsifiable. Would you sort of agree with that?
Yeah. Nice. Yep, totally. And so maybe I'll just zoom out a little bit and say how that fits into the larger set of theses he's making in this chapter. So maybe just for the listener who you should certainly listen to the first episode of this one, because we're going to be drawing a lot on that. But if you haven't listened to that one, the chapter is titled Truth, Rationality, and the Growth of Scientific Knowledge. It's chapter 10, and it's one of his longest chapters, or at least a chapter where he covers a lot of territory. So again, truth, rationality, and the growth of scientific knowledge. So he opens the chapter by talking about just the problem of how we can say that our knowledge has grown. What does it mean for it to grow? He's going to later in the chapter get into questions of like what truth means and what rationality means. But as part of a digression on those themes, he then introduces the idea of content. And part of his claim is that what is rational to achieve are theories with an increasing amount of content. So we can say that Newton's theory is strictly contains less content than Einstein's theory, because Einstein's theory entails Newton's theory in the low velocity limit. And this just jives, at least with me, intuitionally with what I want in scientific theories. I want them to tell me more. I want them to be risky. So a theory like you cannot travel faster than the speed of light is incredibly high content and incredibly risky, because anytime you accelerate anything, the Large Hadron Collider, there's a possibility of this theory being falsified. So it's bold, it's high content, it's bold in its assertions about the world, and it's risky in the sense that it's easily falsifiable. That's what Popper claims is what we rationally want in our theories. And then part of the chapter is contrasting that with the Bayesian approach. Maybe not to open up the disagreement too much, but to just keep moving us through the chapter a little bit. One place where I just want to quote Popper, where he was riffing on themes from the beginning of this episode, where he was more careful than I was, and which I don't know if will fully satisfy our disagreement, but at least I want to say it, is that actually I'll contextualize this a little bit. So the word probability can mean a lot of different things. So it can mean chance, it can mean relative frequencies, it can mean just subjective beliefs. If you're taking a Bayesian lens, you can say that by the probability of something going up, it means I believe it to be more and more true. However, what Popper says is that if we accept the terminology for probability as anything which accords with the probability calculus, which is a term that I should probably explain a little bit about. If and only if we accept this terminology, quoting Popper, then there can be no doubt that the absolute probability of a statement A is simply the degree of its logical weakness or lack of information content relative to statement B. So probability of A given B, if that's high, then this essentially means that statement A is not telling us very much that statement B hasn't already told us, hence why it's a high probability. So my critiques from last episode were specifically about any interpretation of probability that uses the probability calculus. And then you were saying, well, just consider this examples of the Bayesian who sees a bunch of evidence, and then the evidence for their theory, the probability that their theory is true goes up and up and up. I would just say that to the extent that that operation is not using the probability calculus, then the critique doesn't apply. And so because Bayesians can be a little bit wishy-washy with what they mean when they say probability, and they don't actually need to use like the actual symbolic manipulations of the probability calculus, then sure, all bets are off. You can't apply Popper's content critique because they're not actually using the math. I do need to close the loop on what I mean by the probability calculus. And so I'm just going to quickly reference a Wikipedia page that listeners can look up. So if listeners just go to the Wikipedia page on probability and they go down to a table which says summary of probabilities, then they'll see a set of algebraic manipulation rules. So P of A is equal to 1 minus P of not A, for instance. So when Popper talks about the calculus of probability, he's talking about the rules that are allowed with these symbols, and it's a small set. And so to the extent that the Bayesian isn't actually using these rules, then all bets are off. But to the extent that the Bayesian does want to use the actual calculus of probability when they say the word probability, then Popper's critique applies. Okay, so I'll pause there. I'm just going to guess that you're going to find that incredibly unsatisfying. But at least to me, that is one way to resolve the differences, and I'll stop. Yeah, sorry. No.
I do find that incredibly unsatisfying. I mean, okay. my criticism in the previous episode was not simply based on some linguistic trick where I say, well, anyone can define probability however they want and assign probabilities however they want. Therefore, Popper's criticism cannot possibly hold. That's not at all what I was getting at. I'm very happy to remain in the realm where people respect the calculus of probability. Indeed, those are the only uses of probability that I would consider a use of probability in the first place. I'm not sure what it means to do probability or use probability if one is not adhering to the rules of the probability calculus. So no, I don't think that actually bridges the gap on the disagreement whatsoever. I'm again a little bit scarred from our YouTube commenter who called out my debate tactics, namely of screaming at you in the last episode. So I'm not quite sure how far to push this in this episode. So perhaps one thing to say, which is not the only thing I'd want to say, but is one useful thing to say here, is that most uses of probability in practice are operating in environments where the content is actually fixed. So take, for instance, beginning of the pandemic, where we're wondering what the reproduction number of COVID is. Okay, so what we do is we gather some data and we do statistical inference on a family of distributions that could possibly describe what the reproduction number is. Reproduction number? R naught, right? That's what R naught stands for, I believe. This is how many people on average someone else affects, given that they have the disease. This R naught is incredibly important for any sort of mandates about public safety, because if R naught is 10, then we're going to be in a state of pandemic much more quickly than if R naught is 1.1. And if it's below 1, then we don't have to worry about it, because the disease will just die off on its own. Okay, so what we do here is some form of maximum likelihood estimation, basically, where we have a bunch of statistical models and we infer what R naught is based on that. Now, I think what I'm worried about is that a naive reader, or possibly not even a naive reader, I think someone who just took seriously what you said in the previous episode would look at our uses of probability here and say, this is totally invalid. We shouldn't be looking to look, we shouldn't be trying to find the parameter that maximizes probability, because this minimizes the content. This is this is a ludicrous and incredibly dangerous thing to think about the use of probability here. And Popper is not at all careful to distinguish that he actually is operating in this bizarre realm of epistemology where you're like putting a probability over every statement and you're looking for, and you're attaching probabilities to all these theories and everything. This is very rarely how people are using probability in practice. And we already know that the critical rationalist community in general is already very skeptical of probability. And this is just providing them more ammunition that is simply not true and totally unapplicable to how the vast majority of statisticians, social scientists, computer scientists, data scientists use probability. Moreover, the point we really got hung up on in the last episode was that I don't even think that subjective Bayesian epistemologists, so out of the realm of statistics now, I don't even think subjective Bayesian epistemologists would claim to be using probability in this way. I claim that they're actually normally using probability also in realms where the content is fixed, and therefore Popper's critique doesn't apply. And then we had a big disagreement about what exactly Bayesian epistemology does. I'll just point out for the listener that both Wikipedia and the Stanford Encyclopedia on Bayesian epistemology agree with me. And Vaden can point you to apparently one paper by Carl Friston that says otherwise. So anyway, I should let you respond to that, because that was a lot. But
well, let me just say that I totally agree that the use of probability to estimate the R naught value is completely legit, 100%. This is how modeling works. And in previous conversations, we continuously stress that Bayesian statistics is valid and legitimate, especially when you have data.
But just, okay, can we just pause there? I'll let you continue, but just pause there. So if you accept that, but then you look at his if and only if statement, right? So now you want to say, now the probability, when we're looking at, like, say the probability of a parameter or the probability of the data given a parameter, is simply the degree of its logical weakness or lack of informative content. That just doesn't make sense given the application of
100%.
Probability in that specific example, right? And his statement is an if and only if in that case, right?
Yes.
He's making yes. So he's just wrong. That statement is just wrong.
No,
and very misleading.
No, because the Bayesian stats example is not what is a logically entailed statement of a parameter. There is none. A parameter is not a statement. A parameter is not a statement. You can't logically entail anything from a parameter, because his critique only applies when you are applying probabilities to statements such that when the probability is approaching 1, then you can say that that statement is true. And so the Bayesian statistics example is not applicable here precisely because of his if and only if, right? So there are uses of probability where you don't use probability to measure verisimilitude of statements such that you want the probability to go up because you want the statement to be true. When you're talking about parameter estimation and maximum likelihood, you are talking about Bayesian stats, which is measure theory, which is not this. And so when he says if and only if, he is excluding the very example which you have provided.
No, I disagree. I mean, I think if you just gave someone this statement, if and only if, it doesn't say. I mean, you can reformulate any mathematics as just statements. That's fine. And so he's telling you what the absolute probability of a statement A is simply the degree of its logical weakness or lack of informative content.
But the R naught value is not a statement.
Yeah, sure. It is.
R naught value is not a statement.
Why does he say it doesn't have to be an English statement here, right? Like he's just looking at the probability of A.
Okay, let me just. Do you think that there's a difference between estimating the R naught value and estimating the probability that theory of relativity is true? Like, what's the difference between these two examples?
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's he's only
exactly what I'm trying to say.
The latter, but he's critiquing only the latter half.
No, but I'm saying if you just were to read this if and only if statement, and indeed most of this section, so you're bringing to bear a lot of knowledge about the domain of probability and statistics, and I'm also trying to bring to bear that precise knowledge. But I'm saying if you just read this part of Popper, he nowhere makes that distinction, and that's part of my criticism.
But there's a difference between assigning probabilities to parameters and assigning probabilities to theories, right? When we talk about Bayesian epistemology, we're talking about assigning probabilities to entire theories such that we can say that theory is probably true in an epistemological sense. And that's different than saying
I agree that's
that this parameter. Yeah,
totally.
But that's all he's critiquing. That's all he's critiquing. He's not critiquing. That's what the if and only if statement, like what the R naught value is excluded from his if and only if because the probability of the statement A is different than the probability of the parameter P.
I mean, yeah, I agree. And that's my criticism. And so I think anyone else, I think you're reading that into this section because you know that that's true and you agree with me. I think anyone else reading this section would not know that that's what Popper meant and would draw false conclusions. And that's precisely my criticism. So we agree. So now the disagreement is what did Popper mean and what's actually on the page? But yeah, of course, I agree. I brought up the example. That's precisely my point.
Okay, so actually, we can zoom out a little bit. The Bayesian treatment of probability takes as its atomic unit the thing that you're assigning probability to, statements, English statements, whereas let's say the statistical treatment of probability, either via Bayesian stats or frequentist stats, takes as the fundamental atomic unit sets. And so when we talk about parameter estimation, we are not viewing probability as applying to statements from which statements allow for logically entailed other statements, but parameters don't. You can't derive additional logically entailed parameter from a parameter. That's only logical entailment is a property of statements. And so when he says if and only if, he's limiting his critique to only those attempts at using probability on statements as the Bayesians do, which is different than using it in a statistical sense when the fundamental thing that you're assigning probabilities to are sets. So when he says if and only if, he's saying, okay, my critique does not apply to those using probability on sets. It doesn't apply to stats. It doesn't apply to parameter estimation. It only applies to those who want to equate probability, a high probability with a high degree of truth, right? And that's the relationship between probability and verisimilitude, which we're going to get into in the latter half of this chapter if we eventually get there. So maybe we agree. And if you're pushing back on the fact that a lot of crit rats can take this and then say that all of Bayesian stats is wrong, well, those crit rats are misunderstanding what we're saying and misunderstanding the critique here because it does not apply to Bayesian statistics.
I mean, we're close. I think where we disagree is like whether that's clearly illustrated on the page. And I would say no, because it's very easy to take sets and just say them in English language. And so thereby making them statements. So like just relying on the fact that he said statement, I don't think this is good enough.
He should be clear. He should have been clear. Let me just say.
And I'm genuinely not sure if I'd like to take your word for it that that's what he meant. But I'm genuinely not sure. Like I don't know if that's what he meant.
Okay, let's tie a bow on that. Let the listeners figure out what the hell we're talking about. So this we've been arguing about page 297, which is where that quote comes from, and essentially all of part 1, section 3 page 295 all the way up to page 298. So, getting back to the chapter and moving on, unless there's any final thoughts you want to say.
No, let's move on.
Yeah. Okay. In the future episode, when we get to part 3 of this chapter, titled Truth and Content, Verisimilitude versus Probability, Popper is going to tease out these two notions. So verisimilitude for the listener is like, how close to truth are we? I would want to say that Einstein's theory has much more verisimilitude than Newton's theory. So we can never say that Einstein's theory is true, but we can say that it's truer than Newton's theory. And in his book, The World of Parmenides, which contains an essay called Back to the Pre-Socratics, he speculates that these notions of probability and verisimilitude got tangled up roughly when the pre-Socratics were around, so greater than 2,000 years ago, because it's a very intuitive concept to say that something is likely to be true. So something's like the truth, something's likely to be true. Then from likely, you get, well, it's probably true. And then from probably, you get the probability calculus. So what Popper's critiquing is this notion that when you say something is probably true, that means that there should be a high probability, and the high probability maps essentially 1-to-1 to verisimilitude. But he's trying to tease these out. He's trying to say, well, no, verisimilitude is absolutely a concept worth preserving because we want to be able to say something is more likely to be true than something else. But we need to sharply distinguish between that and probability approaching 1. And that conflation, so something's likely to be true, something's likely, something's probably true, something has a high degree of probability, something has probability closer to 1, meaning something is definitely true. 1 is a conversation that no Bayesian statistician ever has because they're talking about parameter estimation. But 2, it is something that Bayesian epistemologists have. And when they talk about the probability of hypothesis going up, they're trying to say that the verisimilitude of this hypothesis is also going up. And so that's how these two concepts have been massively conflated, both in our language and in the philosophy discourse and just throughout culture. And so a whole section is going to be dedicated to that. And we're just kind of jumping ahead a little bit. But that's what is meant when we talk about when Popper has the discussion about the difference between verisimilitude and probability.
Yeah, no, that's nice. I think we'll probably see some of the problems with verisimilitude. I think he sort of tried to solve this problem, but unsuccessfully did, because I think he tried to formalize verisimilitude too much. But I do think that the notion of verisimilitude sort of gives the lie to some of the naive, perhaps, readings of Popper that say things like he didn't believe in any sort of notion of evidence or of like positive evidence for theories.
Corroboration.
Yeah, so he'd use the words corroboration, but like there's this sort of tension, I would say, among people who read Popper where, you know, there's the notion of falsification, which also has some problems, namely Duhem Quine, etc., but is fairly well subscribed to among like people like us, and perhaps actually like the majority of scientists, to be honest. I think that the notion of falsification is quite a popular one. But there is more disagreement, especially among philosophers, about what to do with the notion of sort of like positive corroborating evidence for a theory. And there are those who read Popper who want to say that doesn't even matter. Any sort of positive evidence doesn't matter. Like if we subject a theory to some sort of critical test and it passes that test, that actually doesn't matter. What matters is that we try and like falsify as many things as possible, and everything that's not falsified is in some sort of vague, ambiguous state, and we can't really compare them to one another, et cetera, et cetera. And that Popper was even considering the notion of verisimilitude really says that he was aware of the problem and the fact that we need to be able to compare theories that have sort of yet to be falsified. And he does this both like theoretically by comparing their content, which he calls the notion of potential satisfactoriness. And that's before testing is even done. But then he also needs this notion of verisimilitude to come into play like after things have been tested, right? If one theory has been tested 10 times, another 100 times, like, is there a way we can say that the one that's been tested, severely tested 100 times is somehow better or closer to the truth or something than the one that's been tested 10 times. Now, again, it's sort of widely accepted and I think by both of us as well, that he sort of failed at this project. Insofar as he wanted to put this notion of verisimilitude on very firm logical footing. But then whether he did it sort of heuristically, whether this notion still has merit is more up for debate, I would say.
Yeah. So to fill in the picture a little bit. So he attempts to use the theory of content as well as the relationship between content and probability to mathematically write down how you could actually measure in a numerical way your distance to truth. So he's trying to mathematize verisimilitude. That totally failed. That failed in a way that he agrees with. So he in Conjectures and Refutations, he writes some sketches on how you could do this. And then his student, David Miller, came up with a theorem in the 70s that was essentially a counterexample, which then Popper immediately said he was wrong. And so to the listener, they can look at David Miller's book, just titled Critical Rationalism. I believe it's chapter 10, where Miller talks about this in a lot of detail. So there's a lot of citations that can be chased. And then Popper reflects on Miller's falsification of his theory in the last appendix of Objective Knowledge. So listeners can consult both those two sources where Popper explains the counterexample that Miller proposed, and basically Popper just says, yeah, he was wrong.
Is Miller's theorem that you referenced, is it just a counterexample, or is it an actual theorem that you can't do this, that you run into paradoxes or something if you try and do this?
That's a great question. I don't recall. My memory says it was a counterexample, but I don't feel confident in that. So listeners should double check that. Yeah, I mean, because
that would be quite interesting.
That would be really interesting. Yeah,
that'd be very interesting. And I suspect something like that is probably true, to be honest.
Yeah, because how could, like, if you could measure your distance to truth, like, you could automate so much stuff, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I don't recall offhand. Listeners can go through the sites themselves. But I don't think he failed in coming up with approximate, heuristic, non-formal notions of what verisimilitude means. And so that brings us nicely back to the chapter, so we can get back on track, where, again, he's talking about, like, how can we even say our knowledge has grown? The growth of knowledge is a major theme of this chapter. And one of them is that we can use what he calls the criterion of potential satisfactoriness. The criterion of potential satisfactoriness, terrible terminology, horribly mouth-filling phrase.
He needed an editor for that one. Oh my God.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Is thus testability or improbability. Only a highly testable or improbable theory is worth testing and is actually, and not merely potentially, satisfactory if it withstands severe tests, especially those tests to which we could point as crucial for the theory before they were ever undertaken. So the more testable a theory is, the less probable it is interesting. So why would you want to test a highly probable theory? The highly probable theory doesn't really tell you too much more for what you already know. So it's not very interesting. So you want to test those which are improbable, counterintuitive to the Bayesian. And those theories which have withstood a huge number of these tests are those ones which we're going to say are satisfactory and which are closer to truth in some nebulous and not mathematically specified way.
I feel like I'd want to take issue with this a bit. I mean, I think testability or increased content is a criterion, but it seems like the way he frames it here, right? The phrase he uses is the criterion of potential satisfactoriness is thus testability, sort of drawing an equivalence between those two things. But it seems like we also value other things, right? Like, it seems like we value simplicity, for instance. One thing Paul Meehl brings up, actually, which I think is interesting, is we actually value temporal ordering in our theories. So we actually care if we have two theories that are sort of equally powerful a priori, in terms of perhaps content or the test that they've withstood thus far, we actually prefer the theory that we formalized, that then made predictions, that we then went out and tested, as opposed to the theory that was formalized after we had made observations, and then could retroactively predict what we had seen. Right? Because we all sort of realize that it's sort of easy to come up with a theory that retroactively says what you should have seen when you know, in fact, what you did see, as opposed to one that tells you what you will and should see, and then you go out and look for that phenomenon. And I think you can come up with fairly easy examples to show that just testability isn't all that we want, because you can always append testable statements to the end of theories that make them just more ad hoc and random, but yet strictly increase the testability. So you can just like take your favorite theory and then append, and the universe will end on Tuesday to the end of it. Okay, well, now there's another potential falsifier to that statement. So its content is strictly greater. And yet clearly that's a worse theory in David Deutsch's sense of being, easier to vary and just less strict, I guess, in general.
Yeah.
So what do you make of that?
Yeah. So he actually gives. He says the temporal thing at the end of this paragraph. So especially those tests to which we could point as crucial for the theory before they were ever undertaken.
Does he really? I missed that. That's cool.
Then on the simplicity point, he talks about simplicity in logic of scientific discovery. And he wrestles with this question, like, why do we value simplicity in science? And so maybe I'll just say a few words about that. He ties the notion of simplicity to universality and complexity to conjunctions. So what do I mean by that? The statement, all swans are white, is simple and it's universal because it applies everywhere all the time, compared to all swans are white in London's Times Square, and when the moon has shone at full brightness, and when the lights are on, etc. So you can make highly complex statements by just appending a bunch of qualifiers to it. But the reason that complex statements are less valued in science is precisely because every time you add these qualifiers, you're making it harder to test. So simple statements tend to be more universal. They tend to apply across all time and space, and thus are more empirical and more easily testable compared to complex statements, which are less testable because of all the qualifiers and all of the conditions under which the statement would hold. So simplicity is valued for the reasons of boldness and for reasons of ease of falsification, right? It's easier to falsify simple statements in general than it is to falsify highly complex ones that have a bunch of nuance and caveats. I'm not saying that you can't do that. For instance, the second law of thermodynamics only applies to closed containers, right? But so that's a more complex statement than it just applies everywhere. But that is the statement that has resisted falsification and which the theory has produced for us. And so, of course, you sometimes need complex theories because that's what reality is telling us. But simple statements are easier to refute, easier to discard, and more universal once found. So when you have the statement that you cannot travel faster than the speed of light, that's a beautifully simple and universal statement precisely because it doesn't have qualifiers attached to it. So it reduces to testability and empirical content is what I would say.
Interesting. Yeah.
So moving on at our snail's pace. After this, he goes through just some examples, which I don't think we'll stress too much because we've talked about these. So he talks about Einstein and Newton, Einstein producing a more high content theory. He talks about the unifications. So unification is interesting. So what's a unification? A unification is you take different theories that are complex and you unify them into one simpler, most of the time, simpler theory that explains everything. So a simple example of a unification that I like is the idea that the sun is the same as the stars. That was not obvious once upon a time. Once upon a time, it was like you see these little specks of light. What could they be? It could potentially be heaven poking through, for instance, right? But if you take a unified lens on that, it's that, oh no, stars are just the sun far away. And that's a simpler, more universal theory than the two theories independently. So unifications are valued in science a lot, often because to unify is to simplify. Not always, but often.
It seems like it is. So it does seem possible to come up with historical examples where content actually doesn't increase, or at least strictly increase. But I think in those cases, what's going on is that all the other contenders have just been falsified, I suppose, which is like obviously the first priority of a theory is to not be falsified. Yeah. So, I mean, like classical thermodynamics versus statistical thermodynamics, I mean, statistical mechanics has less content because it's so probabilistic, I think. But classical thermodynamics is just couldn't explain enough. It's just wrong and like too simplistic.
What is classical thermodynamics? Like phlogiston and stuff, or is that?
Well, I was thinking just like reasoning about individual particles, right? So you before Boltzmann came along and said, okay, we need to do statistical mechanics, meaning like we reason about aggregates of particles. We just need to talk about particles in general, which is great until you have more than 3 particles, and then you can't do much. Yeah. And so there, it's just to actually explain any sort of macro level emergent behavior of large scale systems, you need statistical mechanics. And I guess same with things like germ theory of disease. Like early germ theory was naive. It would have just said disease X caused by Y, which is nice and very simple and has high content. And yet it just seems that in practice things are probabilistic and there's many factors, right? And so I guess in each of these cases, even if content has sort of gone down, it's because the earlier predecessors were falsified.
False. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yep. In section 5, so we're moving to page 299. In section 5, he starts talking about deductive systems and axiomatized systems. So maybe the difference between deduction and induction can be thought of as follows. So deduction is logically valid. So if you say something like all swans are white, then that necessarily entails that there is not a white swan in Times Square. So if all swans are white is true, if you assume that is true, then that necessarily means that this other thing must also be true 100% of the time, absolutely with certainty. So I think of deduction and deductive logic as a truth broadcasting operation. So you have one statement here, which you assume to be true, all swans are white. And then if you assume that to be true, then deduction allows us to move the property is true over to other statements that also must necessarily always be true. If your starting assumption is true. That's deduction. Induction is trying to do this process backwards. So induction is trying to start with this swan is white, and that swan is white, and this other swan over there, also still white. And then induction is this process that doesn't work, but people want it to work, which is some mechanism by which we can move from these more localized statements to something that's more general, more universal, that holds in a wider domain. So induction is kind of trying to go uphill where deduction is downhill. That's one way to think about the difference. We've talked ad nauseum about why induction isn't possible, simply because you could always find another black swan. So no matter what magical process people think allows them to induce certain laws, it doesn't work because you could always find some sort of counterexample. Content is all about deduction. So when we talk about logical consequences, we're talking about deductively moving from statement A to some other statement which must be true. And what many people thought was the aim of science is to come up with the final deductive system. So the grand unified theory of physics kind of promises to be this. So the grand unified theory is unifying quantum mechanics and general relativity. And the idea is that once we have this final theory, then we can just deduce all the consequences about everything else in the world. And this is a big problem for Popperian epistemology, because if this was the case, then it would mean that science has an end point, that science can be finished. That once you figure out this final, perfect deductive system, then we're done here, people. We can all go home because we've got it now. And what Popper says in this section, and I'll stop in a sec, is just that this is not possible. We shouldn't view the aim of science as coming up with the construction of an axiomatized deductive system. We should instead view deductive systems as just tools, just stepping stones that allow us to figure out more and more of the world. And that's essentially his main thesis in this section, but maybe I'll let you clean up anything that I got wrong or said inartfully.
No, that's nice. I do wonder where Popper would come down on sort of the modern debate about the utility of theory for theory's sake. So one consequence of his view here, perhaps, is that one should only develop a theory enough to test the phenomenon that you want to test. So you have some new fancy theory of physics, and then you ask, how do we compare this to the old standard model of physics? Well, you formalize and you develop the theory until you arrive at some testable consequence. This usually involves some sort of combination of mathematics and experiment and creativity, etc. But finally you arrive at you do enough work on what the theory actually says about the world to then be able to go look for its hypothesized consequences in the world. But formalization for formalization's sake is not so useful, because what's the point, right? If we're not looking for the big final theory, then if we're just going to formalize it beyond the kind of problems we're actually testing, then this is totally useless. But, there's many scientists now who sort of make their living formalizing theories beyond what we could even imagine testing these days, right? Take most mathematical and theoretical physicists right now. They're not really working on anything that's likely to be tested in the next several decades even. They're working on just these total grand abstract theories. And then you have mathematicians that are working on formalization of theories that aren't even tied to physical phenomenon in the first place. And so I wonder what Popper would think of all of this. I wonder if he'd think we'd sort of lost our heads with how much formalization we're currently doing.
Yeah, so he talks about this really nicely in his autobiography, Unended Quest, which I think I've consistently mistaken as Unending Quest, but Unended Quest. Where he talks about the important difference between precision and clarity, where precision for precision's sake is always a mistake. And I think that I witnessed friends of mine in my PhD that were very obsessed with precisely writing down all of the mathematical formula to be able to make very incredibly precise statements. But in so doing, were just completely illegible to the audience of grad students that they were lecturing to. Whereas clarity is always a value in and of itself. You always want to be more clear. And sometimes to be more clear, you need to be more precise. But you should never be more precise than the problem demands, is something that he says. And so with your question about formalizing and formalizing stuff, I think this actually leads nicely to the next section in this chapter, where he talks about how everything he said so far is still an incomplete picture, because it kind of leads the reader to think that the goal of science is to come up with theories with higher and higher content. But that's not the goal. The goal is to come up with theories that solve progressively more and more interesting problems. And so maybe before we start talking about the next section, I think that his response would be that if you're formalizing a theory in order to solve a problem, then that's all to the good. But to the extent that formalizing becomes the problem itself, then that, I think, can be a big danger, because one mustn't forget that the point of any formalization or any theory is to solve some real problem that we actually care about. And so it's a bit of a temptation, I think, of the researcher to continue with the project of formalization well beyond the point where it's helpful solving a problem, because formalization is something that you can just keep doing and writing papers on it. But I think it's easy to go far with that, such that you've forgotten the original problem that you're trying to solve. I don't know, does that satisfy you or not really?
I think that's exactly what Popper says. So just to quote, he says, consequently, there is little merit in formalizing and elaborating a deductive system intended for use as an empirical science beyond the requirements of the task of criticizing and testing it, and of comparing it critically with competitors. Yeah, so I remember, I think during our conversation with Deutsch mentioned that in a conversation with someone else named Matthias Leonardis, that Matthias's view of Popper is that his most fundamental contribution to the conversation of epistemology is actually the notion of a problem and the idea that problems come first. And the more familiar I get with Popper's writings, the more convinced I am of this thesis. And you can see it pop up even when Popper's not explicitly writing about epistemology and science, but even when he's writing, for instance, about politics and history, he somehow bends everything towards the question of what problem was this thinker trying to solve. And my sense is that this is really the lens via which he viewed the world, both sort of consciously and unconsciously. But my sense is, like, if you could resurrect Popper and dive deep into his psyche, you would find a deep focus on the notion of problems. It just sort of, it comes seeping through all his writing. Again, even writing that's not explicitly focused on the logic of science. And this section 6 here, sort of leaks with this idea. And so maybe just one quote that comes near the end, I think. He says, "Admittedly, our expectations, and thus our theories, may precede, historically, even our problems. Yet science starts only with problems. Problems crop up especially when we are disappointed in our expectations, or when our theories involve us in difficulties, in contradictions. And these may arise either within a theory, or between two different theories, or as the result of a clash between our theories and our observations." So this just goes to what you were saying earlier, which is everything else equal. Yes, we want theories with high content. We want to produce theories where we can very rigorously test all their logical consequences. But at the heart of science is this process whereby we have some problem, either because there's some disappointment we face about the world. We want things to be one way, and they're not that way. There's some other way, and we want to change the state of the world, or just because we have some confusion. We have a theory that makes a prediction that doesn't seem to be correct, or we have two different theories that propose two different things, or we just can't understand what on earth we're looking at. And this is really the heart of science for Popper, is that theories are built to solve these problems. And then once we build theories to solve problems, then we can go about this task of formalizing them, looking at their content, deciding what to test, deciding how to test it, deciding whether a theory has stood up to test, doing all the relevant statistics. All of that formalization and all of the core logic of science comes atop this project of just developing ideas to solve specific problems.
Beautiful. Yeah, wonderful. Well, let's end there. Next time on, we'll be talking about truth. Correspondence theory of truth, what truth means, what is truth.
How to get it, how to get closer to it.
Yeah. Oh, God, I want it so fucking bad. God, give me that truth. Yeah. So yeah, great stuff. And to be continued, my friends. Nice chatting.
All right, see you next time.